That night, a blizzard swept through the White Mountains with the quiet purpose of erasing everything in its path. No rescue sirens, no phone signal, just a retired Navy SEAL, an aging K-9, and a silence thick enough to press against the chest. Then the dog stopped cold. Beneath the falling snow lay two women left behind to freeze to death. But the cold wasn't the most dangerous thing in the forest that night. The truth they carried was, and someone was willing to kill to make sure it never made it out alive. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed was the silence doing a better job than any wall. Snow had been falling for hours in the White Mountains, soft at first, then heavier, then steady enough that the world seemed to shrink down to whatever his headlamp could reach. Wind moved through the pines in slow, tired waves, and every so often ice let go of a high branch and dropped with a sharp little crack. Then the sound disappeared again, swallowed by powder and distance, like the forest was deciding what it would allow a man to hear. Ethan kept his pace measured, not rushed, not careless, the kind of pace you learn when you've spent years moving through places where panic gets people killed. He wasn't in the Navy anymore, hadn't been for a long time, but the habits didn't leave just because the paperwork said they should. His boots pressed a narrow line into the drift, and behind him his dog followed without a leash, close enough to touch but never underfoot. Bear was an old Malinois by working dog standards. The gray at his muzzle wasn't from age alone. It was from a life that had asked too much and then asked it again. He moved with a careful confidence, paused, choosing firm ground, ears scanning in small adjustments, eyes bright in the beam of the headlamp. Ethan trusted him more than he trusted radios, and more than he trusted people who liked to smile at you while holding something back. They weren't out here for adventure. Ethan had a service call, the kind he accepted in winter because nobody else wanted it. A small repeater tower sat deeper in the forest, half buried in rime, and the county liked to pretend it mattered when storms shut down roads and people got stuck without a signal. Ethan didn't pretend. He just did the work, collected the check, and went back to the quiet he'd built for himself. He told himself that was enough. Bear stopped. It wasn't dramatic. No bark, no lunge. Just an abrupt pause, as if someone had pressed a finger to the dog's spine and turned him into stone. His head lifted, his nostrils widened. One ear angled toward the dark to Ethan's left, then both ears fixed forward like needles finding a frequency only he could hear. Ethan halted too, because you didn't argue with that posture. You listened. At first, there was nothing but wind, the long, low hush of snow moving sideways, the faint creak of trees shifting under weight. Ethan held his breath, let the sound settle. His gloved hand tightened around the flashlight he carried as backup, even though his headlamp worked fine. Another habit, another layer between him and surprise. Then, beneath the wind, he caught it. Not a call, not words, something smaller than that. A rough, uneven exhale, like an engine trying to turn over in the cold. It came again, and this time Ethan heard the faint scrape that followed, as if someone had moved an inch and the snow had resisted. Bear looked back at him once, not asking, telling. Ethan stepped off his own trail and into deeper drift. The snow grabbed at his knees immediately, heavy and loose, and the cold pressed through the seams of his coat. He moved slowly, testing each step so he wouldn't break through a hidden hollow or twist an ankle where nobody would find him until spring. Bear went ahead, nose low, tail stiff, the line of his back tense with purpose. They made it 20 yards into the trees before Ethan saw what Bear had already known. Two shapes lay in the snow at the base of a fir, partly covered as if the storm had been trying to erase them. For half a second, Ethan's mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. The human brain will do that sometimes. It'll negotiate with reality for one more heartbeat. Then Bear whined under his breath, barely a sound, and Ethan's body moved before his thoughts caught up. He dropped to a knee, brushed snow away with the side of his forearm, and found a face. Female. Pale. Lips a bruised blue. Eyelashes rimed with frost. Her eyes were half open, but unfocused, the way a person looks when the world has become too far away to reach. Beside her was another woman, turned slightly onto her side, shoulders rigid beneath a thin layer of snow. Ethan swept the powder off her jacket and saw the reflective striping of a work coat, the kind people wore around heavy equipment and winter sights. Her hands were behind her back. So were the other woman's. Ethan's stomach tightened. Not fear. Something colder. He reached for the nearest wrist, and his glove met metal. It wasn't rope. It wasn't plastic zip ties. It was a heavy industrial cuff, square-edged, the kind used to lock down tools or secure equipment crates. It had bitten into the skin hard enough to leave a raw, red groove. The shape of it was wrong in this place, wrong in this weather, wrong for any accident. Bear pressed closer, shoulder against Ethan's thigh, warming the space as if he could push heat into the problem by force. Ethan leaned in and listened to the closest woman's breathing. It was there, but barely. A thin thread pulled tight. "Hey," Ethan said, low and steady, the way you speak to someone standing on a ledge. "You're not done. You hear me?" The woman's lips moved, and for a second, Ethan thought she was trying to form words. But all that came out was a shallow, ragged gasp that ended in a cough. Her body tried to curl inward and couldn't. Hypothermia. Severe. And the storm wasn't finished. Ethan stripped off his outer coat without hesitating. The cold punched in immediately, hard enough to sting through layers, but he didn't stop. He draped the coat over both women, then pulled an emergency blanket from his pack and tucked it around their torsos, sealing what little warmth remained. He kept his hands firm, not rubbing limbs, not forcing movement that could send cold blood rushing to the heart. He'd seen men die from doing the right thing the wrong way. Bear's head lifted sharply. He stared into the trees behind Ethan, body angled, ears forward. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The headlamp beam caught nothing but snow and trunk and shadow, but his instincts, the ones he pretended he didn't need anymore, rose like a door unlatched. Someone had put these women here, in a spot off any trail, in a storm that would cover their tracks in minutes. And they had used metal cuffs, not desperation knots. Ethan looked down again. The second woman's jacket had a stitched name patch, the letters packed with snow. He brushed it clean. Laura. The first woman's collar was turned up, but he could see a strand of dark hair frozen to her cheek. Younger, smaller. Her breathing hitched once, and her eyes rolled slightly, finding nothing. Ethan's throat tightened. He glanced at his phone out of habit. No bars, just the mute gray of an empty signal. Out here, that meant the nearest help was as far away as the forest decided. He swallowed, counted his options, and felt the old weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a pack he hadn't asked to carry. Bear looked at him again, steady and expectant. Ethan exhaled, long and controlled. "All right," he said, mostly to himself. "We're doing this." He shifted his body to shield the women from the wind, checked their pulse points with numb fingers, and began planning the only thing that mattered now: how to get two freezing strangers out of a forest that didn't care if any of them made it back. Ethan's fingers were already losing feeling, but his mind stayed clear. Cold could blur judgment and slow hands. He fought it with routine, the same way he always had. He pulled the women closer beneath his coat and the emergency blanket, making a tight pocket of heat. Bear pressed in on the windward side, a living wall, his breath steaming in bursts. Ethan kept his voice low and steady. "Listen to me. If you can hear me, you're still in this." The taller woman didn't answer. Her chin sagged toward her chest, lashes crusted white. Ethan found her pulse, faint but there. The younger one's eyes flickered, unfocused, then held on Ethan's face for a heartbeat. "Don't!" she rasped, more breath than sound. Ethan leaned in. "Don't what?" She swallowed hard. "Don't call the county." That sentence cut through him sharper than the wind. People who were freezing didn't waste their last strength on warning unless there was a reason. "Name," he said. "Tell me your name." A shiver ran through her. "Sophie. Sophie Kim." "All right, Sophie. I'm Ethan. This is Bear. You're going to keep breathing, and I'm going to get you out." Sophie's eyes shifted to the dog, and for a moment the fear on her face changed into something like relief. Bear didn't look at her the way pets did. He looked like he had a job. He stayed close, shoulder braced against the blanket bundle, steady as a rail. Ethan checked the restraints again. Metal cuffs, thick and square-edged. Not handcuffs, not rope. The kind of lock you'd see on equipment cases or industrial storage, the kind that left a clean, ugly imprint. The skin around Sophie's wrist was torn and swollen, but what made Ethan's stomach tighten was the precision of it. Someone had done this with tools, not rage. Bear's ears snapped forward, his head lifted and held still. Ethan turned his light slowly, scanning the trees. Snow fell thick enough to soften shapes, but Bear didn't relax. His tail stayed stiff, body angled like he was blocking a lane. Ethan forced himself to look down. The ground told the truth. Snow had started to fill in prints, but not completely. A scuffed line where something had been dragged. A patch of snow compressed flat, like someone had knelt there and worked. And farther out, cutting across the powder, two faint parallel impressions. Tire tracks, narrow. ATV, most likely, fresh enough that the edges hadn't collapsed. He pictured a machine idling in the dark, headlights off, a man stepping down, tightening metal around a human wrist with calm hands. Winter doing the rest. Ethan didn't like the picture, but it fit too well. He wasn't taking them to his cabin, not if someone could follow his trail to a door. He cracked two chemical hand warmers and slid them into layers near the women's cores, not against skin. He tucked a spare wool cap over Sophie's head and tightened the blanket around both. Then he took his gloved thumb and pressed gently at Sophie's jaw. "Stay awake," he said. "Talk to me. Anything." Sophie blinked slow, fighting the dark. "We were working," she whispered. "Laura's an inspector." Ethan kept his eyes on her face. "Why out here in a storm?" Sophie's lips trembled. "Because the numbers didn't match. We found something that wasn't on the map." Ethan didn't ask what it looked like. Sophie's eyes squeezed shut, then opened again. "They put us here," she whispered. "They said, 'Let the snow do it.'" Ethan's jaw set. "Who?" Her teeth chattered too hard for clean words. "I don't know. We found something. Laura, she said it wasn't right. She wanted to report it, not through the usual people." At her name, the taller woman made a small sound, like a cough that couldn't become a cough. Ethan touched her cheek, cold enough to scare him, and kept his voice level. "Laura, if you can hear me, blink." Her lids fluttered once. That was enough. Bear lifted his nose, sampling the air, then looked back at Ethan with that old working focus. "You don't have time." Ethan slid his arms beneath Laura's shoulders and lifted. Her weight came up like dead wood, too limp. His lower back protested, and he ignored it. Sophie tried to stand and folded at the knees. Ethan caught her before she hit the snow. "Easy," he said. "Save it." He looped a length of cord around his waist and under Sophie's arms so she could lean into him without pulling him down. When she sagged, the cord took just enough weight to keep her upright. Then he looked at Bear. "Lead." Bear moved off between the trees where drifts were lower. Ethan followed, carrying Laura and half-dragging Sophie, boots sinking, thighs burning. Behind them, snow kept falling, erasing the small violence that had happened here. But Ethan could feel the pressure between his shoulder blades anyway, like eyes on his back. Somewhere out there, someone had decided these women were supposed to disappear. And now, because Ethan listened to a dog, they had a problem. Chow. The old weather station appeared out of the snow the way forgotten things often do, not suddenly, but after you had already committed to believing it wasn't there. Ethan saw the roofline first, low and squared, half buried where drifts had piled against the walls. The structure sat in a shallow cut between firs, protected from the worst of the wind, its silhouette dull and patient under ice. No lights, no tracks leading to it that hadn't been softened by the storm. It was the kind of place that survived by not being noticed. Ethan brought them in through the lee side, keeping his body between the women and the open trees. The door resisted at first, swollen with moisture, then gave with a tired groan that sounded too loud in the quiet. Inside, the air was colder than the forest, but still, a flat, dry cold that didn't cut as sharply. He eased Laura down first, laying her on a bench along the wall, insulating her from the wood with spare clothing and his own coat. Sophie sagged against the table, hands shaking as circulation fought its way back. Bear moved in last and stopped just inside the threshold, facing out. He didn't shake the snow from his coat. He didn't lie down. His posture said this place was not finished with them. Ethan worked quickly, methodically. He stripped frozen layers, replaced them with dry wool from a storage crate he remembered from years ago, and coaxed a small stove back to life with practiced patience. The flame took slowly, like it didn't trust anyone anymore. When it finally caught, the sound was almost gentle. He adjusted the vents so heat would rise without cooking them from the inside out. Laura's breathing remained shallow, but steadier. Her skin was cold to the touch, waxy at the edges, but color began to creep back toward her lips. Ethan watched for the signs he feared and didn't see. Them. Not yet. Sophie sank to the floor near the stove, back against the wall, eyes closed but alert enough to flinch when Bear shifted. Ethan knelt in front of her, keeping his voice even. "Tell me what you found," he said. Slow, she swallowed. "Pressure readings. The line that cuts north of here. It was wrong, too consistent." Ethan nodded. "Consistent how?" "Too clean," she said. "Natural systems aren't that tidy. Laura thought someone was bleeding pressure on purpose, or hiding it." Ethan glanced at Laura, then back at Sophie. "You reported it." Sophie shook her head. "We tried. The reports bounced. Delayed. Someone kept fixing our entries." Ethan felt something settle into place, not surprise. Recognition. "What about your supervisor?" he asked. Sophie hesitated. "Mark Holloway. He told us to stop pushing. Said winter made sensors unreliable. Then he told us to take a few days off." Ethan rose and moved toward the window, brushing frost from the glass with his sleeve. Outside, the storm pressed in close, flattening distance. He didn't like how perfect the cover was. He scanned the tree line carefully, then saw it. A small, dark shape strapped to the trunk of a birch no bigger than his palm. A pinprick of dull green light blinked once, then went dark again. Ethan's jaw tightened. He stepped back, lowering the shutter without comment. "We're not alone," he said, "and we're not invisible." Sophie's eyes widened. "They followed us?" "They're watching," Ethan said. "Different thing." Bear shifted, weight moving forward, ears locked. He let out a low sound from deep in his chest, not loud enough to carry, but full of warning. Ethan checked the back wall next, moving slow, feeling for drafts that didn't belong. Near the rear corner, the snow outside had been disturbed, packed down into a shallow depression that didn't match the wind's pattern. Someone had stood there. Not long ago. He returned to the women and crouched beside Sophie. "Did they say anything else?" She nodded weakly. They told us it would look like exposure. No noise? No mess? Laura stirred then, a soft groan breaking from her throat. Ethan moved to her side immediately. "Laura," he said, firm but gentle, "if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Her fingers twitched. Then, faintly, they closed around his glove. Ethan exhaled, slow and controlled. "Good. Stay with me." Her eyes opened to slits. "They don't want attention," she murmured. "That's the point." Ethan met her gaze. "Then we're going to be a problem." He stood, straightened his shoulders, and looked around the small cabin. Old radios sat on a shelf, dials yellowed with age. A tangle of wire hung from a hook near the ceiling. Tools left behind by men who had trusted the weather to keep this place quiet forever. Outside, snow continued to fall, patient and thorough. Ethan felt the shift. Inside himself, the one he had pretended he didn't know anymore. The forest wasn't just shelter tonight. It was a test. And somewhere beyond the trees, someone was waiting for winter to finish a job that had just gone wrong. Ethan waited until the stove pushed a little life back into the room. Laura's shivering eased from violent to steady. Sophie's lips regained a hint of color, though her hand still shook. Bear stayed near the door, half turned toward the women, half toward the darkness outside. Ethan kept moving. Stillness was how you got trapped. He found an old first aid kit in a metal cabinet, dusty but usable. The square-edged cuff marks on both women were swollen and torn. He cleaned them gently and wrapped them, working with the calm focus that used to keep other people alive. Laura didn't complain. Sophie watched every move like she was filing it away for later. "You said there's a camera," Sophie murmured. "I saw one," Ethan said, "so we assume eyes are on this cabin." Laura's eyelids lifted. "They weren't locals," she whispered. No shouting, no panic, just work. Ethan nodded. "Tell me what happened." Between breaths, Laura pieced it together. A maintenance gate that shouldn't have been open. Tracks that didn't match any county vehicle. A dark ATV with the lights killed. Gloved hands. One calm voice saying, "Stop asking questions. Phone's taken." Then the cold, the cuffs, and the certainty that the storm would erase everything. Ethan crossed to the front window and lifted the shutter a fraction, just enough to look. Snow swirled in the beam of his headlamp. 30 yards out, the birch trunk where he'd seen the device sat like a black post in white. A faint green blink pulsed once, then disappeared. Not random. A heartbeat. A check-in. He lowered the shutter and set a chair beneath the handle, not because a chair could stop a determined man, but because noise bought seconds. He moved the women farther from the windows, out of any straight line to the door, then laid his flashlight and knife within reach. Bear watched him do it, ears forward, as if he understood the language of preparation. As Laura spoke, Ethan checked her jacket where it hung near the stove. When the fabric warmed, it released a thin odor that didn't belong to pine or smoke. Sharp, clean, like solvent. His instincts tightened. He found a tacky smear inside the lining, a dull sheen under the light. Sophie saw his face change. "Is that gas?" "Not sure," Ethan said, "but it's not normal." Bear's head lifted. His body went rigid, ears angled toward the back wall. He didn't bark. He didn't rush. He simply stared, as if the cabin itself had shifted. Ethan listened the way Bear listened, for change. The stove crackled, snow tapped the roof, and beneath it, so faint it could have been imagination, came a tiny metallic tick. His eyes slid to the rear door. He didn't walk straight to it. He moved, wide, keeping his feet off the obvious path, then crouched by the threshold. The drift outside looked wrong, packed in a shallow arc like a boot had pressed it down. He brushed loose powder aside. A thin wire lay across the floor at ankle height, tight as a string, nearly invisible against the dark wood. "Don't move," he said, voice low. Sophie's face drained. "What is it?" "A trip line." Ethan followed the wire to the corner. Half buried under crusted snow blown through a gap sat a compact taped device, crude but lethal in a tight room. This wasn't a warning, it was a finish. He slid his knife out slowly. Cold tried to steal precision, but he forced his breathing steady. In, out. Bear stood behind him, silent, ready. Ethan cut the wire clean, pinned the loose end, then eased the device toward him. He separated the power source with careful pressure and set the pieces apart like they were fragile glass. The cabin stayed quiet. The stove kept crackling, unaware of how close they'd come to becoming smoke and splinters. When Ethan stood, Laura stared at him, eyes clearer now, not from warmth, but from fear. Sophie's gaze flicked to the shuttered window. "They put that there for us?" Ethan shook his head once. "They put it there for whoever interfered." Laura swallowed. "We should leave." "Not blind," Ethan said. "If we run blind, we die blind." Bear pressed his shoulder into Ethan's knee, a firm, grounding shove. Outside, the storm kept falling, patient and thorough. Somewhere in that white silence, someone expected winter to complete a job by morning. Ethan looked at the shelf of old radios and wires and felt a hard clarity settle in his chest. He hadn't come out here to fight anything. He'd come to be left alone. But someone had chosen these women to disappear, and someone had chosen this cabin to become their last room. Ethan decided he wouldn't let either plan stand. Night settled in the way it always did after a storm paused to catch its breath. The snow still fell, but lighter now, slower, as if the forest had decided to listen instead of roar. That kind of quiet made Ethan uneasy. Loud weather covered mistakes. Silence exposed them. He dimmed the lantern until it barely pushed light past the center of the room. Shadows pulled tight against the walls. Laura lay wrapped near the stove, breathing steadier now, eyes open and tracking. Sophie sat with her knees drawn in, arms wrapped around herself, every muscle tense. Bear stood at the back corner, facing the rear wall, posture squared and ready. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A pressure change. The subtle sense that the night outside had leaned closer. Then came the sound. Not a step, not a branch snapping. A faint scrape, like fabric brushing bark, followed by nothing at all. Bear's tail went rigid. Ethan raised one finger, signaling stillness, and shifted his weight slowly. He moved to the side of the cabin opposite the windows, careful not to silhouette himself. His breathing slowed until it matched the quiet rhythm he'd learned years ago, when listening mattered more than seeing. Another sound followed. A soft crunch, barely audible, snow compressed under a careful foot. Whoever it was knew enough not to rush. Ethan closed his eyes for a heartbeat and mapped the space. The birch with the camera, the packed snow near the back, the slope beyond the trees. Someone was circling, testing angles, waiting for a mistake. The crack of the rifle came without warning. Wood exploded inches from where Ethan's head had been a moment before. The shot was clean, controlled, meant to measure reaction, not kill. Splinters flew. Sophie gasped and clamped a hand over her mouth. Laura flinched but didn't scream. Ethan dropped flat and rolled, pulling the lantern cord so the light died completely. The cabin plunged into near darkness, lit only by the stove's low glow. Another shot followed, closer this time, punching into the wall where the light had been. Bear moved instantly, placing his body between the women and the direction of the sound, teeth bared, silent, and lethal. Ethan waited. He let the shooter think he'd frozen. Outside, snow muffled movement, but not entirely. He heard a shift, a careful repositioning. The shooter was advancing, slow and confident, expecting fear to do the rest. Ethan rose just enough to create a shadow near the storage shed attached to the cabin, then dropped back. He kicked a loose board so it clattered, loud and clumsy, and counted. 3 seconds later, a shape moved where he wanted it. Ethan burst out the side door in a low sprint, cutting wide instead of straight. Cold air tore at his lungs. He hit the drift hard, rolled, and came up behind the advancing figure as the man adjusted his aim toward the false sound. The collision was sudden and brutal. Ethan drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, knocking the breath out of him in a sharp, wet grunt. They went down together, sliding on packed snow. The rifle skidded away, disappearing under powder. The man fought back, trained, not panicked. His movements were efficient, not sloppy. He tried to roll free, but Ethan pinned him, knee into the lower back, forearm across the neck, just enough to control without crushing. "Don't," Ethan said quietly, more statement than threat. The man froze, then laughed once, breathless and short. "You picked the wrong night." Ethan bound his hands with cord, tight and practiced, then rolled him onto his side. He searched him quickly. Cold weather gear, no patches, no ID. A compact radio clipped inside the jacket, earpiece still warm. From the radio came a low burst of static, then a calm voice. "Status?" Ethan pressed the button before the man could speak. He didn't disguise his tone. He didn't need to. "Delayed," Ethan said. "Package compromised." Silence followed. Then, flat and precise, the voice answered. "Recover it." "No. Witnesses?" Ethan let go of the button and looked down at the man. "Package?" he said. "That's what they call them?" The man's eyes were sharp even now, calculating. "You should have walked away." Ethan stood and hauled him to his feet. "You shouldn't have come back." Bear appeared at his side, teeth inches from the man's thigh, a reminder that further resistance would be brief and painful. Together, they dragged him into the lee of the cabin and secured him behind a support post, out of the wind, but not out of reach. Inside, Sophie stared at Ethan like she was seeing him for the first time. Laura's jaw was set, eyes hard. "They're not stopping," Sophie said. "No," Ethan agreed. "They're escalating." He glanced at the old radios on the shelf, then back at the man bound outside, shivering now as adrenaline drained away. Somewhere beyond the trees, others were listening, adjusting plans, assuming winter would still win. Ethan felt the familiar weight settle fully into place. The night had crossed a line. Whatever this was, it was no longer about waiting to survive until morning. The man outside stopped struggling once the cold reached him, not because he was beaten, but because his body understood the math. Ethan checked the knots one more time, then stepped back inside and barred the door. Bear followed, taking his place between the women and the windows, eyes fixed on the dark like it might blink first. Ethan didn't rush. Rushing was how plans broke. He crouched by the stove, held his hands close to the heat until the stiffness eased, and listened. Outside, the forest had returned to its patient hush. No footsteps, no engines. Whoever else was out there had paused to reassess. That bought minutes. Not safety. Minutes. Laura watched him with clear eyes now, the shock thinning as warmth and purpose returned. Sophie sat forward, hugging a small black object to her chest, like it might float away if she loosened her grip. "I have something," Sophie said. Ethan looked at her. "Show me." She opened her palm. A memory card wrapped in tape to keep moisture out. Her fingers shook, but her voice steadied. "I copied the raw data. Pressure logs, timestamps, location markers. And audio." "Audio," Ethan repeated. Sophie nodded. "Mark, telling us to stop asking questions, telling us it would be handled." Ethan took the card and turned it between his fingers. Small things carried big weight these days. Handled how? Sophie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ethan rose and crossed to the shelf of old equipment. The weather station had been mothballed years ago, but the bones were still there. Analog radios, coax cable, a battered control unit that had once spoken to satellites no one remembered caring about. He brushed dust from a dial and smiled faintly. "They didn't tear this place down because it was useless," he said. "They left it because it was quiet." Laura shifted, wincing. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking they're counting on isolation," Ethan said. "On the storm, on local channels." Sophie's eyes widened as understanding caught up. "You're going around them," Ethan nodded. "I'm making noise where they don't want it." He worked fast now, not frantic, but focused. He ran cable, checked connections, adjusted frequency bands by feel more than sight. Bear stayed close, occasionally lifting his head when the wind changed pitch, then settling again. Outside, the man bound to the post coughed once, then fell silent. Ethan powered the unit and waited. The radio hummed, a low, steady sound like a held breath. He keyed in a sequence from memory, the kind drilled into him years ago when redundancy meant survival. The signal went out wrong on purpose. He injected a fault pattern into the band, one that mimicked a pressure failure cascading through linked infrastructure. Not a small alert, not a local ping. The kind of anomaly that forced automated systems to escalate, to reach past county desks and sleepy night shifts and straight into federal oversight. A red indicator blinked. Once, then steady. Sophie let out a shaky breath. "If they see that—" "They won't see it," Ethan said. "They'll feel it, and they'll panic." Laura closed her eyes briefly. "Mark always said the worst thing was attention." "Then we're giving him plenty," Ethan replied. The radio on the table crackled to life. Not voices yet, just activity, handshakes, a system waking up and asking questions it had been told not to ask. Outside, an engine coughed in the distance, not close, not retreating, testing. Ethan didn't look at the door. He stayed with the radio until the pattern locked in. Then he stepped back, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself a single, measured nod. The line had been crossed, but on his terms. The bound man outside laughed, thin and bitter, when Ethan opened the door to check on him. "You just called in the wolves." Ethan met his gaze. "Good." The man's smile faltered. "You don't know who you woke up." "I know exactly who I woke up," Ethan said. "People who ask questions." He shut the door and slid the bar home. Minutes stretched, then headlights washed the trees. Closer now. Wrong angle for a patrol. A pickup rolled into view and stopped short of the cabin. Engine idling. Two figures stepped out, reflective vests catching what little light there was. "County emergency," one called, voice too loud, too practiced. "We got a signal." Ethan didn't answer. He watched through a slit in the shutter as Bear's hackles rose. The man outside shifted, eyes flicking to the newcomers. Fear finally broke through the bravado. Ethan waited. A second set of lights appeared on the ridge, brighter, steadier, approaching from the opposite direction. Then a third. The pickup's engine revved. The figures hesitated. A voice boomed across the snow, calm and amplified. "Federal response. Step away from the structure." The county men froze. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in relief, but in acceptance. What he'd done couldn't be undone now. The quiet life he'd built was already behind him. He opened the door as agents moved in, weapons lowered but ready. Bear stayed at his side, solid and calm. Sophie clutched the card. Laura straightened, pain and resolve sharing space on her face. Outside, winter kept falling, indifferent as ever, but it was no longer finishing someone else's work. The first thing Ethan noticed about the county emergency men was their boots. They were clean in the wrong places. Anyone who had walked the last 100 yards through fresh powder would have wet snow packed into the seams and clumped around the heels. These two had a dusting like they'd stepped out of their truck and taken 5 careful steps for show. Their reflective vests looked new, the kind that still held sharp creases. And the way one of them kept his right hand low, near his jacket pocket, wasn't the relaxed habit of a responder. It was the quiet discipline of someone who expected trouble and brought it with him. Ethan stayed inside the cabin with the door cracked just enough to see. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply watched and let the night reveal itself. "Sir," the taller man called again, too loud, too friendly. "We got an alert from your location. We're here to help. Open up." Ethan didn't move. Bear stood beside him, shoulders squared, ears forward. The dog's eyes were fixed on the men, like he could smell the lie on their breath. Laura pushed herself upright on the bench, wincing, and Sophie clutched the memory card so hard her knuckles turned pale. "They're not real," Sophie whispered. "No," Ethan said. "They're early?" Outside, the shorter man took 2 steps closer and angled his body sideways, presenting less of a target. That alone told Ethan more than any badge could. He'd seen that posture before, just in different places, with different weather. Behind them, the bound attacker shifted where he'd been secured to the post. His face tightened, eyes flicking to the newcomers with something that looked like fear. He wasn't afraid of Ethan. He was afraid of what came next. The taller responder turned his head slightly, as if listening to someone through an earpiece. Then he smiled into the snow and lifted his hands. "We're just trying to get these folks out," he called. "No need to make this difficult." Ethan lowered the shutter another inch, leaving only a narrow slit. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Tell me my name," he said. The taller man paused. "Sir, we don't have—" "My name," Ethan repeated, calm and flat. Silence. A small, deadly pause where the wrong answer could get someone killed. The shorter man shifted his weight, the hand near his pocket tightening. The taller man's smile thinned. "Ethan," he said, like he'd pulled it from a file and hoped it would fit. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Nobody local would call him Ethan. Not out here. The few people who knew him at all used Cole, and they said it like a warning. Ethan glanced at Bear. The dog's lip lifted, teeth showing without sound. "You're lost," Ethan said. "Leave." The taller man's friendly tone hardened. "Open the door." At that moment, light bloomed through the trees from the ridgeline, brighter and steadier than headlights. Not a single truck. Several. Angled apart, forming a controlled approach. The beams didn't sweep wildly. They held lanes like someone had planned them. A voice carried through the snow, amplified but calm. "Federal Response Team. Step away from the structure, hands visible." The county men froze. The taller one's shoulders tensed, and for one sharp second, Ethan saw the mask slip. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. The shorter man's hand darted toward his pocket. Bear exploded forward with a bark that filled the cabin like a gunshot. Ethan yanked the door wider and stepped out just enough to be seen, keeping his body between the federal lights and the women inside. "Don't," Ethan called, not to the fakes, but to the whole situation. "They're armed." Agents moved in from both sides with practiced geometry. No shouting, no bravado, just the quiet efficiency of people trained to end problems before they become tragedies. The shorter fake took one step back, then another, as if he might run. An agent met him with a weapon leveled and a command spoken like fact. "On the ground, now." The taller man tried to talk his way out. "We're county. We got the alert. We're—" An agent cut him off. "County doesn't roll unmarked, and county doesn't carry that." A second agent had eyes on the pocket. The shorter man's hand twitched again, and the agent closed distance in 2 strides, pinning him into the snow before anything could come out. The movement was clean and fast, like the last chapter of a story written long ago. Ethan stood still, breath steady, watching the lie collapse. A woman in a dark parka approached the cabin, face half hidden by a hood, eyes sharp. "You the one who triggered the infrastructure alert?" Ethan nodded. "Signal anomaly injection? I didn't have another way around local." Her gaze flicked over him, over Bear, then toward the bound man at the post. "Smart," she said, and it wasn't praise so much as recognition. Behind her, agents secured the fakes, pulling badges from jackets that didn't match any department. One of them produced a sidearm. Another found a second radio, sealed against moisture, still warm from use. The woman agent turned back to Ethan. "We need everyone inside. Now." Ethan stepped aside as she entered, and Bear moved with her without protest, as if he understood authority when it came wrapped in competence. Laura sat straighter, eyes hard with anger that finally had somewhere to go. Sophie held up the card with shaking fingers. "I have evidence," Sophie said. "Data and audio." The agent's gaze softened only slightly. "You did good," she told Sophie. Then she looked at Ethan. "And you did more than good. You changed the board." Outside, someone shouted a location. Another voice called for a medic. The bound attacker at the post began to speak, fast and desperate, trying to trade information for warmth. Ethan watched the agents listen without giving him comfort, and he recognized that too. Professionals didn't promise. They verified. The storm kept falling, quiet and steady, like it had all the patience in the world. Then, through the open door, Ethan saw something that made his stomach drop. One of the agents held up a laminated badge pulled from the fake county man's pocket. The logo on it wasn't county at all. It was the private safety contractor for the pipeline project. Laura's voice turned to ice. "Mark's people." The agent's jaw tightened. "Then this runs deeper than we thought." Ethan felt the same hard clarity he'd felt when Bear first stopped in the snow. The night wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Because if someone in that system was bold enough to send a cleanup crew into a blizzard, then someone else was bold enough to make sure the truth never left these woods. And Ethan had a feeling the next move wouldn't come wearing a reflective vest. Morning did not arrive all at once. It never did after nights like that. It came in thin layers, the darkness loosening its grip inch by inch, the forest revealing itself slowly, as if deciding what it would allow to be seen. Snow still fell, but lightly now, drifting instead of driving, softening the sharp edges left behind by boots, tires, and fear. Ethan stood just outside the cabin, breath clouding the air, hands tucked deep into his coat. Bear moved a few yards ahead, nose down, tracing familiar ground with the calm confidence of a job finished properly. The dog's tail swung in an easy rhythm, no longer stiff with warning. Whatever danger had come with the night had moved on, carried away in federal vehicles and sealed conversations. Behind Ethan, the cabin looked different. Not damaged beyond repair, but marked. A scar along the outer wall where a round had bitten into wood. Footprints trampled into the snow where agents had worked quickly and without ceremony. Evidence bags now replaced the quiet patience of winter. Laura and Sophie sat inside with blankets wrapped tight, steam rising from mugs they hadn't realized they were holding. Medics had checked them carefully, slow and methodical, making sure warmth returned without shock. Their hands still trembled, but their eyes were clear. That mattered. A federal agent approached Ethan, boots crunching softly. She held a tablet under one, arm, her face drawn, but steady. "We confirmed it," she said. "The data from her card matched what our systems flagged when your signal hit. Pressure manipulation, hidden bypasses. It's been going on longer than anyone wants to admit." Ethan nodded. And Mark Holloway? Picked up an hour ago, she replied. Tried to shut down a server remotely. That didn't go well for him. Laura closed her eyes when she heard that, not in relief, but in release. Sophie's shoulders sagged, the tension finally finding somewhere to go. There will be hearings, the agent continued. Quiet ones at first, then louder. Some people won't like how much light this brings. Ethan met her gaze. They rarely do. She glanced toward the cabin where the two women sat together now, not speaking much, but not alone either. They'll be protected, she said. Witness status. It won't be easy. Sophie looked up at that, her expression calm but resolute. It wasn't easy before. The agent allowed herself a small nod, then turned back to Ethan. You didn't have to do what you did, she said. You could have waited. You could have walked away. Ethan watched Bear pause and circle back, checking the perimeter one last time before settling near his feet. I tried that once, Ethan said quietly. Didn't take. The agent studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. You changed everything tonight. Ethan shook it, firm and brief. I just refused to let it stay quiet. When the vehicles finally pulled away, their tracks leading back toward roads and systems and paperwork, the forest closed in again. Not with threat, but with indifference. Snow continued to fall, patient and clean, covering what it could. Some things would always be buried out here. Others had fought too hard to stay hidden. Laura and Sophie prepared to leave with the agents, bundled and supported. Before she stepped into the truck, Laura stopped and turned back. You could have stayed out of it, she said. You didn't. Ethan shrugged slightly. Sometimes staying out is the choice that costs more. Sophie hesitated, then pressed the memory card into his hand. For the record, she said, this started because someone listened. Ethan closed her fingers gently around it and shook his head. That belongs with the truth now, he said. Not with me. They left soon after, their silhouettes swallowed by snow and distance, headed toward a different kind of storm. The cabin grew quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet Ethan had built his life around. It felt earned. He went back inside and began to work, not rebuilding everything, just what mattered. He replaced the damaged plank, sealed the draft near the back door, set things back in order. His movements were steady, unhurried. Bear lay nearby, eyes half closed, present without needing to watch. By midday, the sky thinned to a pale blue. Sunlight cut through the trees in narrow bands, catching on untouched snow. Bear rose and trotted ahead into the open, carving new lines across the white. Ethan followed, stopping at the edge of the clearing. He breathed in the cold air, sharp and clean, and felt it settle deep in his lungs. The forest no longer felt like a place to disappear. It felt like a place that had asked something of him and been answered. Ethan Cole had gone into the woods expecting silence. What he found instead were 2 lives left to freeze, a truth someone thought winter could erase, and a choice that refused to be ignored. And in choosing not to look away, he had changed everything. If this story stayed with you, even after it ended, take a moment and let us know. Simply comment 1 if you believe doing the right thing still matters, even when no one is watching. Or comment 0 if you think most people would have walked away. Your comment helps this story reach others who need it. And if you want to keep hearing real stories about courage, quiet strength, and the moments that change everything, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. There are more stories coming.